Now, if you'll notice, the title of this is Human Relations Seminar. It's pretty hard to have a seminar with, what, 200, 250 people, looks like. Anyway, at least 200. But I am very much in favor of as much informality and freedom to talk and to question as is humanly possible. We probably should try different ways of dealing with this. At least for the start, what we'll do is, because the group is so large, I'll just throw out some of my ideas, some of my questions. And at any time, if you have a question, if you don't understand what I've said or I haven't made myself clear, feel free to raise your hand and we'll have some interchange and maybe raise a few other kinds of questions. And if that wastes too much time, if we can't get to all the material that I would like to cover, and maybe you would also, why, we'll try some other tack. Now, basically, the way I have conceived of this course, it's a good word. It's pretty bad. Or the seminar. It's impossible in 6 sessions to cover, all of the material and answer all of the questions. So, what I want to try to do is, in the 4 sessions that I have with you, to try to touch on areas, topics, interests, raise questions, and give you some of the ideas that I have about these things, and then hopefully get you to respond to me. And respond, I mean, disagree with me as much as you like. I don't claim in any way to be the be-all and end-all. There really aren't any experts in this field. Absolutely not. There are people who read a lot, have read a lot. There are people who've lived a lot. There are people who've listened a lot. And maybe, hopefully, I will fit into that last group. As you know, I'm a therapist. I've worked with people for all these 15, 20 years, and come up against many kinds of problems and questions. And what got me going on presenting this kind of material to a group of college people especially, basically was 2 things. One, over the years at the Ham Clinic when I was there, and since I've been away from there, I've seen a lot of college kids. And over and over and over again, the same kinds of questions about their own sexuality, about sex. A lot of misconception, as I saw it, and a lot of things that just weren't misconception, but hadn't been thought through, and were things that hopefully I at least started them toward thinking through. Not that I gave them any answers, because as I say, there are many things that this is a very individualized kind of concept, very individualized kind of area and problem in terms of the kinds of problems that come up. And so that the answers for me aren't the answers for you in many aspects of sexuality. The course, as you know from the outline of the seminar, will contain tonight, which is introduction, trying to get to know who I am a little bit and give you some ideas of terms and how I look at them, and also begin to raise some of the questions. The next 2 sessions are what some of the sexologists call organ recitals, in terms of talking about some of the basic physiology, some of the various kinds of questions which only a person trained in physiology and medicine can answer and can deal with. We'll go into such things as not only the the physical aspects of intercourse and masturbation and so forth, but also contraception and whatever. Now, one other thing that I want to do, with a group of this large especially, it's awfully hard to just get up and ask questions. I think what we should do is, if you will write down questions that you have, not put your name on it or anything, just on a slip of paper, anything, any questions that you have at all, absolutely any, and turn them in at the end of each session. We will use the last 15-20 minutes of each session to answer the questions that you have. Okay? And Dr. Guerrero has expressed a lot of interest in this endeavor, so he has agreed to be here for all 6 sessions. And I'm sure I'll be leaning on him heavily because I don't in any way claim to know physiology. And so he will be here to answer any questions that you might not come up with, during the next 2 sessions. Okay? So if you'll just write them out on any paper that you've got and turn them in, I guarantee you that every one of them will be answered. If you have any good dirty jokes, you can throw those in. Now, as you noticed in the brochure, I'm a clinical psychologist. So the area of my interest and my concern is that of clinical psychology, and thus relevant to personality and people and how they function. Sex is one part of human functioning. There's no doubt about that. It's also one part that over the centuries, maybe since Adam and Eve, people have been worried about, has caused various kinds of concern. At the present time, as you know as well as I, there is supposedly some kind of a revolution, sexual revolution. What it appears to be, to me, is that because of many factors in history, because of the large population of young people, if nothing else, because of the communication business being what it is, many, many things have come together at one time to create a new kind of freedom of thought, a new freedom for expression of ideas, and a new freedom for exchange of ideas. And with this, you see, there has been an opening up in all spheres of human activity, and sex is just one of them. People are beginning to question more, and even in addition to questioning more, are comparing notes for the first time, and especially about sex. Because of this, maybe some of the old cliches, the Protestant ethic, whatever you want to call it, the Judeo-Christian tradition, a lot of this stuff has begun to be challenged. Well, how does this fit? Why does this apply now? And beautifully and rightly so. We've got to continually question and search and look and see what does apply and what is, in that sense, applicable to this generation, to what's going on around here now. So, my tack is that of people and how they function. And therefore, looking at sex as just part of human functioning. And even more so narrowly defined, looking at sex as an interpersonal kind of functioning. What goes on between people. And this is how I'm going to approach the whole the whole topic. First, to a definition. Sex, the word sex as such, as I see it, is the generic concept. It includes all of the things that we think about as human sexuality, that is, this whole business of identification, role as male and female, and is a very small part of it, really, is intercourse. Most of the people, you know, when they talk about sex or they use the term sex, they just are thinking about intercourse. And then we get to the other thing. As I said, there were a couple of things that made me want to deal with this topic. I have been pretty disturbed over the last 5 years or so. All the books that have been coming out, a book that a friend of mine wrote, Dr. McCary, down in Houston, for his course on sex. By the way, that was the first one about 5 years ago. That's what it says in the catalog, University of Houston, sex. It's really great. It's a credit course, full credit course. 1,000 kids in, I think. And that, as was said by the dean, that is one of the ideas for this. It's an experimental kind of seminar to test interest, test reaction, many people, including faculty, to see if this might be a credit course on campus. Maybe next year, don't know when. Okay. All of these books that have been coming out, and their entire focus is on physiology, what a penis looks like, what a vagina looks like, the physiology of conception, well, that's most of it, you know, VD and so forth and so on. And a little bit maybe on positions for intercourse. And this is sex. This is presented as the be-all and the end-all. This is what is going to make people, a lot of them, you know, the popularized ones, this is going to make your life wonderful. This is living, and this is going to make your marriage perfect and all this kind of stuff. Well, you don't have to be around too long. You certainly don't have to be married too long before you find out that intercourse as sex is only a very small part of what goes on between people, even relative to their own sexuality. And very few of the books, the courses, address themselves to any of these other kinds of questions in terms of what goes on between people. And this is why I have generated this kind of interest. So sex as such, as I want to use it, is the generic term. Sexuality, as I want to use it, is a word that applies to roles, the kinds of identifications and feelings we have as males or females. And then you can narrow it down a little bit in terms of sexuality at certain times when we feel sexy. And I don't mean necessarily times when, you know, there's petting being engaged in, but also the kinds of sexy feelings that people have when they're all dressed up, when they are presenting themselves as sexual beings. And this is all involved in what we call courting behavior, as you know. Intercourse, I don't think I have to define for you. I do want to narrow it to coitus as such. And then we will use other terms for other kinds of sexual intercourse between human beings. I'm not just saying between males and females, because we certainly will want to talk about homosexuality and, well, everything else. Okay, I won't define any more terms. I just wanted to get those out of the way. When I started to go into this whole area, one of the things I did was not only trying to pick my own brain and read some and talk to some people that were friends, you know, and so forth, and some other professional people, but I also got together a group of people that I knew who would disagree with me. And I knew they would disagree with me because we have what is called now, what is labeled the generation gap. These were some college people, some people not in college, some friends I've got over at the Draft Information Center and so forth. And I asked them to fight with me about this in terms of some of the ideas that I threw out. Like, what's intercourse for? What is sex all about? What's the meaning of all of it? One of the things that came up, now these are all kinds of questions that I think we should go into and will in time. But one of the things that came up was a position taken by at least one of the people there that really intercourse is no different than shaking hands. That it's just an extension of human interaction. It's another way to say hello to somebody, to say you love them, say you're interested in them, say you like them. It's another way of sharing something with somebody. I think, a lot of people probably have this feeling. And in many respects, it's a very valid one. I think it's much better than taking the opposite stance, and that is that, this is something extra special and different and separate from everything else in the world, because it's not. And yet, is there something very special? Is there something peculiar to this activity that other activities just don't have? The question I raise then is, why is sexual interaction, intercourse as part of that, so important? What makes it more important than other kinds of things? And I think I have some kinds of answers to that question. And again, remember, I'm saying I'm not the expert. I don't think I have all the answers to that question by the long shot. And I think that the answers that you have to it are just as valid as mine. So I would like to present some of mine to you, and hopefully you can help me expand the list. The traditional answer to that question, the one that exists in most of the major religions of the world, especially the Jewish, the Christian religions, all of the Christian religions, and I think some of the Eastern ones too, is that intercourse, sexual relation and intercourse as such, is important and different because of its end. Because it is what produces progeny. It is what maintains the species, the race. And this, of course, makes, and as all of you who've studied religion know, this is what sets up a kind of hierarchy of value. And it's the end that really is the more important than the function itself. And that's part of the reason that there has been so much hang-up about this whole business of whether intercourse itself is really that important and whether we should even talk about it, whether it isn't just something very private that we don't look at, that it's a means to an end, and that's all, just a means to an end. Well, there's no doubt about the fact that that's the way babies are born or begun. No doubt at all. Except we started really being concerned about the population explosion and really being concerned about other kinds of things. A little broader view was taken. And some people said, well, maybe intercourse is for fun. Maybe it's not just to produce children. And, it wasn't too long ago, for example, that the Catholic Church finally allowed us how maybe intercourse was for fun, in addition to producing children. That people could get fun from this kind of activity. And with the population explosion, with the pill, and all of the developments that are going on in that area are just fantastic, as Dr. Guerrero is going to tell you, I'm sure. We have to look for other kinds of answers to that question, because we can basically control, even much better than has ever been done before, when intercourse will produce that child and when it won't, when we don't want it to, when we're going to use it for something else. Well, there are some other kinds of answers. Let's look at sexual interaction as behavior. The first thing that stands out about it is its intimacy. It's probably, outside of the nudist camps, it's the only time that people take off their clothes with each other. It certainly is probably the only time that people take off their clothes with each other and touch each other. So it is, in this sense, an experience, an interpersonal experience, in which, in a very practical, real sense in terms of clothes, but also emotionally, we are maximally exposed to another human being. You could say, and I think, that it is the most intimate kind of human interaction. Now, those of you who thinking it all fast will say, well, there are a few other intimate kinds of human interactions, like when somebody's going to kill somebody else. That's pretty intimate. And it's touching, and so forth, but even that isn't so much anymore, since we're using guns and bullets to kill each other. We don't ever touch anymore doing that. So I will, if you want, I'll add the most intimate, the most exposed, positive human interaction. Now, there's an aspect of that that is the important one to me. And that is, in that exposure, within that human interaction, within that exposure, this is the situation in which people most, if ever, let their guards down, let what the psychologists call their defenses down. And turning it around in that sense, this is the situation in which people are most vulnerable. When we shake hands, you're really not letting your guard down. What are some other answers? Some of the philosophers have said that what makes this particular interaction so vital is that it is in this situation that we come closest to perpetuating our own lives forever. Now, this is close to that other thing about ends relative to children, but it's more than that. And on a philosophical basis, this is the kind of situation in which we potentially can perpetuate ourselves. In that sense, continue our own existence onward. In the same light, this is the one situation in which our own existence, our identity as part of that existence, our role, our sexuality as a male or female human being, is most or maximally verified. This is the one situation in which another human being is letting us know that we are another certain kind of human being to the maximum degree. We are something very special for that other person. And in this interaction, they are letting us know that. Two of the last two answers that I've got, and as I said, I'm sure there are more, are ones that, at least one of them that I mentioned before. It's fun. What does that mean, though? Some authors have talked about a phenomenon. I think if you've read Eric Byrne and the games people play, and people have written about this before him, but there's a behavior that human animals take part in, that other animals take part in more dramatically, called stroking behavior. If you've ever watched a mother cat with her kittens, she does a tremendous amount of stroking. We used to call it cleaning, that she was cleaning them off with her tongue. Well, it's probably cleaning, but the physiologists say that it's more than that. That unless that behavior goes on, there are certain sections of the nervous system that don't develop properly. Maybe you can tell us about that tomorrow night, or next Tuesday. There has been research with humans, with young children, infants, that shows that if they don't have holding and rocking, if they aren't stroked as such, they don't develop normally. And in some situations they die. So it's not hard, to carry this a step further, that we all need this kind of interaction. And this explains, I think Burns says, this explains why we shake hands. And then he goes to a verbal communication basis. This is why we say things like, hello, how are you? He says that's a stroke, that we are verifying one another's existence, but we are all rubbing each other, kind of thing. This is part of what makes sex fun. That it is a very intimate, but still a kind of stroking behavior. Another thing, on a purely physical level, it's a release of tension. There is such a thing, and this is also, as Dr. Guerrero will tell you, there is such a thing as physical sexual tension, and this is a releasing mechanism for it. If all of these things apply, if these things do make sexual interaction, intercourse, and all of the other sexual things that go into sexual interaction maximally important, in the sense more important than other kinds of behavior, then we have a base for saying that this is a certain kind of vital function for human beings and has to be treated as something special. Now, why, even if it's going to be treated as something special, why do we want to make all, as I talked about before, all the fuss about sex that's been made? Why do we want to have a course about it? You can read books. There are lots of books, and most of us, I'll generalize to you, but my generation, we got our education down at the corner drugstore, or from friends, or from the dirty books that we picked up now and then. That kind of information is fairly readily available. Why all the fuss? Why all the... Well, I think there are some reasons for that, too. In the first place, especially within the Judeo-Christian tradition, sex has become very mysterious. Because it's defined as so intimate, and because it had this kind of ethereal end of producing children, it was something that people didn't talk about. But another reason why it wasn't talked about, why people didn't want to talk about it, is because they were afraid. And I think this goes along with one of the answers I had anyway, because of the amount of exposure that is involved. Because it is an area in which we do let our defenses down, in which we are most vulnerable. You just don't talk about those times, when, for example, they didn't perform exactly the way you thought you should perform. And it's only whispered, I think I have a problem of impotence, or, gee, why don't I ever have a climax, and these kinds of things. This whole air of mystery built up, and the secretiveness. Also, funny kind of thing, because of the secretiveness, and because of other things that I want to talk about, it's a great area for the development and flowering of fantasy. Just, everybody's got a magnificent sex fantasy, everybody thinks. Well, really, there are very few. Most of them are pretty dull. And funny thing is, though, when you have a fantasy life built up around something, especially as exciting as sex, you don't want to talk to anybody about it and get the bubble broken. You don't want to find out that that fantasy just ain't so. You don't want it challenged. So again, you've got reason, you see, to keep it going. Keep juggling that bubble and not showing it to anyone, not even giving the possibility that it's going to be broken. Another is that people are pretty sure that if you begin talking about this, it's going to take the fun out of it. Another one on a psychological level is that sex, sexuality, sexual interaction involves something that really is kind of scary, and that is feelings. In a general sense, we can talk about two spheres, the sphere of our feelings and the sphere of our intellect. And the intellect, thinking, ideas, thoughts, has this beautiful logic to it, or somewhat logical anyway, and it represents control. Feelings, whereas on the other end, represent all of these physiological things that we identify as feelings, the gut reactions of fear and sexuality, or sex, whatever it is, wherever you want to put it. And not only the physiology, though, the psychological aspects, the anxieties and so forth. And these are all, there's no control there. They represent lack of control. So feelings are what are attached to sexuality and to sexual interaction. And because it's a feeling area, there's fear involved, the lack of control, and so I don't know what that other guy's going to do with his feelings. I know what I'm going to do with my feelings, but I don't know what the other guy's going to do with his. And you have the element of fear. The extreme case, of course, is the kind of panic that goes through a city when the newspapers print these big, large type, girl raped, so forth and so on. There's a very real element of fear that goes along with sexuality as such. And so we don't talk about that. Hopefully then, we can use this media, the opportunity to talk, and to, I'm sorry you have to do so much listening, but to listen, to examine ideas, to consider ideas as a way of breaking down those fears and taking away some of the mystery. And I don't think we'll take away any of the fun. Okay. There is an area that a lot of people take for granted about sex that I guess I want to challenge at this point. Most people think that sex is a basic human drive. Well, depending on how you define basic, it's not. Certainly it's not basic human drive in terms of individual human survival. You don't need sex to live. A lot of guys might tell you girls that, but just not so. You need food, you need oxygen, you need various chemicals and so forth. You don't need sex to live. You don't need sex to live a reasonable, adjusted life. There are a lot of people that do without it. On a species level, of course, we need sex for survival as species. We've already talked about that. There's even question by some as to whether we've ever proven the point that many people take for granted about man is a social animal, that people need people. I don't know it's ever been proven. We do take it for granted. Certainly on the basis of our early survival. Infants need parental figures. But we have to question. Some guys say that I can live all alone on a desert island and get along just fine without other people. And some people call them kooks, and some people don't. We don't know. To this extent, we have to at least challenge the idea. We know that people need people for up to a certain level of maturation. We would like to think that people always need people, especially because pretty soon we're not going to have any choice. There isn't going to be that much room, and so there are always going to be people around, and we're just going to have to face the fact that we have to live with them whether we need them or not. But we have to at least question, do people need people? And in this sense, do we need other human beings for the kinds of things like stroking behavior that I was talking about on an adult level? Man can maybe live comfortably. I don't know. You tell me. I hope I'm raising more questions than I'm answering them, but you can tell me that as we get through. Let's talk about sexuality. Back the early days of our existence, I'm talking about us as infants, maybe even from the moment we're born, we have a sexuality. I think we do, and I'll tell you why. First place, a large part of what we define as sexuality, our sexual selves, our roles as sexual human beings, a large part of that is culturally defined. And the people who write the magazine articles about the sexual revolution, are things changing, like are women's roles changing, women being more independent and so forth and so on. Well, there isn't any revolution because there's always cultural evolution and cultural change, and these roles are always changing. They only remain fixed within some very broad limits. So, a child's role as such, his sexual role, is defined for him before he's born, relative to the culture that he's born into. Then you take that and narrow it down in terms of the needs, the pressures, the education, and the models, the modeling kinds of things that go on after that, and you come up with what we have as our own, each of us, in terms of our own sexual being. Usually, you hear parents, when a woman is pregnant, talking about is it going to be a boy or a girl, and so forth and so on. And they are already defining role. They're defining role with the name that they're going to give to this child. As soon as the child is born, it's Johnny or Susie, and at that point it has an entire set of sexual identifications. Its physical characteristics, to that extent then, just verify that. They fulfill it, as it were. What happens then as this child is growing up? This child finds out from these people with whom it is growing up, and then more people, and maybe, brothers and sisters, the whole bag. what it is like, what it is supposed to be like to be male, to be female. And there has been fairly recent research that has proven pretty definitely that upwards of 90% of what is defined as sexual role is learned and not physiology. And most of it is learned in those very early years. Now, if I don't, I think I will, but if I don't, you remind me, we'll talk about this, especially when we get to the question of homosexuality, because it's a fascinating consideration. So what happens? As we get older, and the little girls wear the cute little dresses, and the little boys wear the shirts with the ties and all this kind of baloney, and we keep adding on to these roles and these images. We develop in a very, an exponential way, internalized conceptions of what we are as males and females. Not only are we being defined by others as that, but we are defining ourselves as that also. And then it becomes circular. Not only is the world defining us as male or female, we are defining ourselves as that, but then we are telling the world to define us in this way. So it goes around and around. What happens, though, when we get to be early adolescents? These roles take on some new kinds of meaning, primarily because we begin to relate them to specific individuals. In other words, it's not only that I am a male for men, for boys, for the girls, but I am a male for this particular female. And my teenage son once said to me, why is it that you feel more like a male when you're with a female than you do when you're with other males? It's because of this kind of identification from a specific other that verifies our sexuality. Now we will talk, in talking about problems in human identification, sexual identification, about problems in which people don't seek this out, or don't get it, or they get mixed signals, and the kinds of things that happen. But in a general sense, this sexual role as such is a learned thing. And it accounts for a large variety of behaviors. Not only the externals, that we have, the dress, the hairdo, and so forth and so on, but even such things as some details of language, how we speak, some details of, certainly many details of interest, patterning of interest. And people get upset when their expectations relative to their own sexuality, or the sexuality of others, how they want to define others, don't fit. So especially, with this generation gap thing that everybody's talking about, everybody gets upset when the guys start wearing their hair long, and, what do they say? You can't tell one from the other back. Or when males and females start dressing alike, this makes people very nervous. Now, why does it make people nervous? Not because they're worried about whether you are adequately defining yourself sexually, but what about me? What does that mean in terms of my sexual identification of myself? If yours is kind of wishy-washy, this means that mine might be kind of wishy-washy too, and then where am I? So So it's a matter of, again, this business of fear. I jokingly, before, I don't joke too well, so it wasn't a great joke, but I jokingly said that the guys, are going to try to convince the gals that this is a very basic drive, and if they don't have it, they're going to die. They have to have their intercourse, and so forth and so on. In terms of this sexual identification thing, it becomes a little more serious, because a lot of guys and gals do use this in a psychological sense. The only way I can define myself as a sexual person, the only way I can define my role, is by virtue of sexual activity. And many, many problems are attached to that. When you work with people who are emotionally disturbed, these are the kinds of things that come up over and over again. That unless I have certain kinds of relationships that provide certain kinds of things, this means I'm not a man. Or this means I'm not a woman. And look at it. Does it really? I wonder if it does. I'm wondering, whether we want to begin some of the other aspects of this, and I guess we should, since it's only 8 o'clock. And we'll talk more of this whole business of sexual identification, sexuality as such, within each one of the areas in which we go into further on. Most of the things that have to talk about relative to sex have no specific kinds of foci as such, because they all exist on continuum from one extreme to another, and within any one individual, one to the other, so that even the amount of sexual identification as such, you all know that there are degrees. We all talk about how feminine she is, how masculine he is, so forth and so on. So that what I want you to do is to add these things for me as I talk, because I'm not going to continually say, oh, this is a matter of degree, and I'm not talking about everybody there. They fit someplace on this scale. But I want you to understand this. Let's go back and something sexy going on. Talk about some of the interesting kinds of things that go on in terms of our early sexual identification, our early sexual roles. Freud said, that people get their sexuality and their sexual identification and their sexual problems very, very early in their lives. And he said that they have sexual feelings about their mothers and about their fathers and so forth and so on very early in their lives. I don't want to fight with Freud. What I want to do is talk about a way of looking at this. First place, this stroking behavior does go on. Just watch a mother with her baby. Watch a father with his baby. We don't know on what level, you see, there is sexual stimulation involved in this stroking behavior of the infant. We know that it does some things to keep him alive, that it does some things to help him develop as a human being, as a living organism. Freud said that because tiny little babies have erections, that this means that they're getting some kind of sexual stimuli. Well, people later on said, that's ridiculous. We know that There are other kinds of things like a full bladder, that create an erection. Let's not get too excited about that. But it is, some things do happen relative to the parents do begin to deal with their infant children as sexual human beings. And infants, and as they get a little older, especially the young kids, do begin to get sexual activity involved in their lives. Masturbation is probably very much an outgrowth of just the natural kind of exploring behavior that all children do to find out about their own bodies. You know, what am I all about? And they go looking and they go touching, and there is, you know, it's a circular thing again. You touch yourself here and you feel it. Well, you touch your genitals and there is a sensation, and the small child touches his genitals and there is a beginning of a sexual feeling. This doesn't become specific. He doesn't define this as something having to do with his sexuality relative to what this might mean for another person, until it's defined as such by the adults with whom he has contact. How is it defined? Well, in some situations it's defined just by watching what goes on. Because some children have the opportunity to watch their parents have intercourse, for example. Some children live in homes where parents very freely, naturally kind of don't wear any clothes. A young girl told me the other day that she wasn't sure about this activity in her home, especially because her parents seemed so uncomfortable about it all the time. As she looked back on it, she said they all took it very naturally that nobody walked around without any clothes on at home. But then she wonders, now that she looks back on it, why her parents kept asking her if it bothered her. She doesn't know whether it bothered her or not, and she doesn't know what relation that has to her promiscuity. But she thinks that it might have some relationship, but she's not sure. Well, I don't know either for sure. But these kinds of things are what go into our and defining ourselves as sexual human beings. Another thing that goes into it, I gave the extreme case of a child watching its parents have intercourse. All this is an extreme, certainly in some aspects of our culture, in our society, where this is forced upon children because of the lousy living conditions that people have to have and so forth. But there are other kinds of things that a little more subtle, just as much impact on the child, that go on in nice suburbia. And these are the things that involve the way parents talk about their own sexuality, and the way parents talk about their relationships with other people, and then what this means to the child. Now, the child is much more knowledgeable and observant about what's going on in his home than parents ever imagine. There isn't anything that's going on that the kids don't really know, but most parents don't think so. When Daddy pinches Mama on the fanny, you see, child knows this. What does it mean to the child when he sees this kind of behavior? Well, it doesn't mean a darn thing except by virtue of the way these people deal with it. If this is the prelude to an affectionate hug, or if it's much different than if it's the prelude to, damn it, leave me alone. This is, you see, where these things begin to have some meaning for the child. Now, when Daddy pinches Mama on the fanny, what does it mean relative to when Daddy pinches the neighbor lady on the fanny at a party? The child sees both of those things. Basic behavior is the same, it's pinching. But look, we got a better show going on out there. Maybe that's where the lab course is. Now, there can be various interesting, you just use your imagination, or read the book, various interesting reactions in terms of the people involved. But in terms of the basic behavior being the same, look at the possible confusion for that child. Why do you do this with this person and do this with that person? What does it mean? What does it mean in terms of how you relate to people, or what a man is and how a man behaves with a woman, or what a woman is and how a woman behaves with a man? And this is all fed into this computer or whatever we've got up here that comes out in terms of how we feel about dealing with other people. Children do a tremendous amount of modeling. We say it every day practically that we have anything to do with mothers and children, all that child looks just like you and acts just like you and so forth and so on. Of course the child does, because he's patterning himself after this parent. To this extent, his own sexual role is patterning himself after this parent. And we talk about, the fact that certainly a girl should have a mother around because it's through her mother that she learns how to be a woman. And even if we just talk about it on the surface, it's through her mother she learns how to cook and sew or iron or whatever. But also, a girl needs a father around, because it's through this father that she learns what it's like to be a woman for a man, and that she learns how men deal with women. This is a very gradual, again, subtle kind of knowledge that's built up over the years. So that ideally we all need, and of course we all get them even if we don't have them in the home. A father is dead, or there was a divorce at a very early age, or whatever. There are male figures from whom we pick up the things that we have to get from male figures, and female figures from whom we get these things. And I guess what I'm saying, just expanding this concept of sexuality, is that people don't realize the kind of impact that these associations have. We just take it for granted. Or else we say, well, because he's a boy, because he has testicles and has these hormones, a little bit more male hormone than female hormone, and he dresses like a male, then that's what makes him male. But it just isn't so. I guess that's probably enough about sexuality and about identification. First class, our seminar, or whatever you want to call it, I don't know, I must have generated some questions. Does anybody want to ask any? Yeah.
How they justify people having sexual operations to change from men to women?
Justify it?
Or should they not have them? Or should they undergo a state psychiatric?
Well, in terms of the, I hope you'll remember this and ask it again, because there are going to be two different answers. I can give you some psychological ideas about it. I think Dr. Guerrero can talk to you about the physiology of it too, and there's information on both sides. First place, for those that they do the operations on, they do a pretty strong, long-term, I think it's a year or something, screening. So that most of them that do apply for sex change operation don't get the operation. And they do get some kind of psychiatric treatment quite often. I don't think this is a contradiction as such, because most of these people have had some fairly chaotic kind of learning experience relative to their sexual role. The pattern is usually one in which, and I say usually now, don't know, I'm talking in pretty sense, but the usual pattern seen is one in which you have a weak father. For the men who want to be women, that's what most of them are. A weak masculine figure, very weak, and a very strong feminine figure that's strong in terms of the kinds of masculine roles that she plays. And then you add to that a lot of other things, like the last one I saw that I sent to the university was a situation in which not only was the father a very weak person, but he went along with, from the very beginning, a defining of this male child as being a female child. They didn't want a male child, or mother didn't want a male child, for her own psychological reasons, which is her own neurotic kinds of reasons, and proceeded to rear this child as a female child. So that he wasn't encouraged to play with boys or do anything that men did. He played with dolls. And he stayed home and he helped Mama. Darn good cook. Knew how to iron. All those kinds of things. So there were tremendous psychological pressures on this male organism to not function as a male organism relative to our the roles that are defined within our society. Anybody else got a question? Yeah.
You brought out earlier this challenge that all you need in life, you put it that way. Food, clothing, shelter, something like this.
No, I said those are basic things that one needs for life. Yeah. Not food or clothing and shelter, but certain foods, chemicals as such, water, oxygen, carbon dioxide that are needed to maintain life, that are basic to the existence of life.
So I'm maybe asking a more philosophical question.
Mm-hmm.
Is that life or is that existence?
Oh, no, I won't go into that. That is very deeply a philosophical question. All right, I guess I would have to agree that that's existence as such. You get into all kinds of then other value areas relative to what life is. If you want to make a dichotomy or separate those. Life might then have to include certain kinds of things that you would define. Then you would have a big argument with a lot of different people as to whether sexual interaction has to be defined as part of one of the values that you put into that definition of life.
Well, what about stroking that you talked about before with sexuality and the way that stroking as well?
Sexuality comes from stroking behavior. Stroking certainly can be included in this broad sphere of sex, yeah. That's why I made that sexual interaction. And within the generic term of sex, you can include stroking behavior. Many people would. And then if the research is accurate, sometimes this stroking behavior is necessary for the maintenance of even life, of existence. But then you get into all kinds of picky things, because is this sex or is this a physical necessity in terms of the proprioceptive nervous system that we...
Maybe what I really want to ask, you seem to have something you were passing on here about the man wanting to talk to you about anything.
No, not that. I'm just saying that we have to, I don't think we should just take for granted any statement from ourselves or from others that I need this or I'm going to die. That sex is a vital thing to one's existence.
Although I imagine some both male and female feel that way.
Yeah, but then when they feel that way, they should ask themselves what it's all about, really.
You can't now.
If you're talking about the them that I'm thinking about, probably can't. That's right. But that's why you've got to think about it before and answer some of these questions to possibly build in some delay mechanism. Remember, I was talking about this business of the difference between affect and intellect. In terms of affect being, in terms of feeling, lacking this element of control, as we usually think about it. Pure affect, pure feeling, doesn't contain this control element to it. And we can get carried away by pure feeling unless we introduce the control element of intellect, and that is the delay, asking yourself some questions. That's
But then author, psychologists and sociologists, I don't know who they be, but who might suggest that necessary for life is some type of sexual interpersonal relationship, or whatever you call it. I don't know, as getting into adolescence or married life or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, there are some who would say this is a vital part of the so-called normal personality. I was questioning that. I would question that. Whether it has to be. I think that, I think it's I'm going to get into this area later, but it certainly is a experience in terms of its uniqueness that maybe has some kinds of maximizing potentiality for the definition of what people are. I don't know if you're familiar with Maslow's business about the hierarchy of needs. Well, he talks about the highest need as being that of self-actualization. And what I would propose is that maybe there's one above that, interpersonal actualization, in which
Love is down with
that's right. But interpersonal actualization, not in terms of love, but in terms of as much energy being directed to helping another human organism attain its self-actualization as is directed toward oneself. And then I tie this into you're way ahead. We're way ahead of me in the sense that I want to tie this into the concept of what marriage is for. So we'll talk about that some more. Yeah.
Maybe I missed it, but what is the regard between love and sexual?
I didn't talk about love. I didn't use the word love because love is another thing that has to do with a lot of value positions and value judgments in terms of what goes on with people and people valuing one another for themselves and for each other. And I think that although it is involved, and maybe depending on the situation, but within this range, it's involved in sexual interaction. But the reason I left it out is because it muddles the waters. So, you see, because so much sexual interaction goes on without love. And then if you start trying to say which is which and so forth, I think that it doesn't help. It just makes things more complicated. So I left it out intentionally. We can talk about it some more if you like when we get to that. Those last two sessions. By the way, there's a misprint in your program. It says interaction for all three of those. The first one is intra-action. Intrapersonal, not interpersonal. talk about some more about sexual fantasy and masturbation, and the kind of sex that goes on just by myself. Would you take a few minutes to write down any questions you have, if you want that, especially if you want Dr. Guerrero, that you might want Dr. Guerrero to address himself to? Yeah.
Could you maybe outline a little bit more what you would be covering, or what would be covered in this seminar, or what you group?
Sure.
Right now?
Did I cover it all adequately the next two sessions? Dr. Guerrero is going to talk about physiology.
Spend like 5 minutes on each, say what it might be, or what.
He's going to talk of. Why don't you come on up here and help me out? He's going to talk about glandular functions and basic physiology, right?
Right.
We're going to talk about the physiology of intercourse, the physiology of conception, and the physiology of contraception, the physiology of many of the things that I think about and concerned about relative to menstruation and so forth and so on. What else did we?
Then as being in charge of the health service, it has caught to my attention that there are a lot of problems, and mostly due to lack of knowledge in relation to diseases that are related to sexual interpersonal relationships, like gonorrhea, syphilis, time that a person can get pregnant, and so forth. So I want to cover in the 2 lectures that I will be given, first, the basic facts of physiology. I have to emphasize this is facts that I'm going to talk about. You will have to attach the value label to them. That's difficult. And then in the second lecture, I want to talk mostly about the social aspect related to the college student. And this means sexual hygiene and diseases that you should know about, because otherwise they can go on and wreck your life in the future. Then I would like you to write down the questions that you would like me to answer specifically, because as you understand, these are very broad type of subject. It is impossible even to cover half adequately all of them. So I want to know exactly what are the special points that you are interested, so I can touch as deep as possible with the time I have in these specific points, besides covering the minimum that you need for this seminar.
Does that kind of give you some understanding what the next two? Okay.
This will be
The next 2 lectures. Right.
beyond that.
Next Tuesday and then the Tuesday after that. And the last 3 are again my thing. And the one after that is the intra-personal sexuality, in which I want to talk about masturbation and sexual fantasy. And I'll tell you, as I told you, I think in terms of continua, what I'm thinking of is a model that divides interpersonal sexual contact up relative to the amount of interpersonal activity involved, from one extreme to the other. So we will talk about intrapersonal sex first, and then interpersonal sex that does not involve a marriage contract, and then interpersonal sex within marriage, and this will involve many things relative to a lot of the questions that people have about when and why and how, and also kinds of problems that come up relative to sexual problems within marriage, and what breaks up marriages sometimes relative to sexual problems. And I want to try, it's awfully hard to cover everything, but I want to try to at least touch on the various sexual perversions as I go through this. Also, in the same sense in terms of the amount of human contact. So that, for example, the voyeur has a relatively minimal human contact. Next up on the scale maybe would be someone who exposes himself, you know, and then next up on the scale would be, then we get into interpersonal kinds of sexual things, homosexuality, heterosexuality. And what heterosexuality, as I see it, is all about psychologically, because there are all kinds of interpersonal sex. It serves many, many functions. And what I want to talk about is the kinds of functions that I see it serving. I hope to get you talking about it too. That covered? Any other questions? Next Tuesday at 7. Thank you.